Our housing systems are not really actually circular or regenerative. Our food systems are industrialized and they're really focusing more on GDP and export. Our clothing is synthetic and it's kind of becoming a sustainability issue. There's a dependency on certificates and a massive government subsidy to keep you there, and it's a rental model. There's no opportunity for what I like to think of as stability or even upward mobility, because the ownership model is completely missing, and it's getting harder, and it's actually getting, in my opinion, irresponsible. It's harder and harder to have 20% to put down on a 30-year fixed-term mortgage to be well qualified. We can build a better home in a factory, and we're proving that with our first project in Hudson, North Carolina. And that's where I've chosen to focus at least the next decade of my career, is really talking about like the purity and the natural regenerative process of physiological needs. And what I realized was that none of that messaging was landing. It was just wasn't resonating. It was an echo chamber of conversation. So I started kind of coming back down to like, what are the basic things we need to get by?
What do you mean by the hashtag stable living?
In our first Pathway Communities model right now, we're just trying to tackle a couple of things. One, obviously, people talk about affordable housing, which is only as good as its occupants and only as good as the ownership model that's created. There's a dependency on certificates and a massive government subsidy to keep you there, and it's a rental model. There's no opportunity for what I like to think of as stability or even upward mobility, because the ownership model is completely missing. We always use the example of renting a car, not treating it maybe as well on a boys trip, or go into a hotel and turn the air conditioning real low and leaving the lights on when you leave. That relationship with that asset or that opportunity to engage in that is just sort of, it's contractual and it's short term. But when we have an ownership perspective on something, we take care of something a little bit more. So stable living to me is starting to bring that ownership model into all the things, all housing, food, water, shelter, clothing, and really kind of proliferate this concept of ownership.
Home ownership is a key piece to that, is it not?
Yeah, and it's getting harder, and it's actually getting, in my opinion, irresponsible. It's harder and harder to have 20% to put down on a 30-year fixed-term mortgage to be well qualified. That's one part. The other part is that wage right now in America anyway is trailing 60%. So there's a lot of numbers out there right now. The average salary right now in America is $68,000. I'm sorry, the median income. The median home price is about $440,000. So, just to get to that opportunity to buy that first home, you are going to be strapping into a long-term commitment for sure. And it doesn't pay respect to things like insurance that go up and taxes that go up. Plus, the average home in America is 41 years old. So you're going to have maintenance costs associated with that ownership model. So just getting to that ownership perspective now, especially if you're saddled with debt from school, you haven't even thought about having kids yet. You probably got an old car. If you're anything like me, getting out of college, you started kind of with nothing. Getting to the point where we have security or safety nets just seems like such a far leap off of that bottom plateau.
Do you have any data on how many people, what percentage of the American population are homeowners versus renters?
I don't, but I do know this. Only 13% of the United States population has a salary, which is crazy.
13?
And 13%. So, most of the folks that work in the United States now are either gig or contract, or
wow,
hourly.
that's a staggering number, man.
Yeah,
13%.
Crazy facts. 13%. The other crazy fact is that our home inventory is so old. We're going to have this great resurgence real soon because the baby boomers are going to age out of their homes. But you know what that means. We're going to have an inventory of product that's on the market that goes back to as is, buyer beware. There's a tidal wave coming in a lot of ways in America because we had that population boom in the 40s, post-war, and that population boom is aging, which is starting to impact a lot of things, right? A lot of our systems.
I never really thought about till you just mentioned it, Chris, is the boomer generation homes largely are massive and just way bigger than it's like when your parents start getting rid of their old giant clunky furniture and they're like, "Hey, do you want this?" I'm like, "No, it weighs 40,000 pounds and it's dark wood and maybe a little depressing." And but like these homes are like probably 3,000, 4,000, 5, 6,000 square foot homes where like it's an inventory mismatch, right? Or what
Also,
people.
the price tag is corresponds to that size. So who buys up all of these homes when they become available? It's the investment companies, the VCs, and then they're rented out on Booking.com and Airbnb, and the problem is exacerbated more.
We're back to extraction. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They're microeconomies, right? So short-term, long-term, private equity, venture capital, these are all different microeconomies that are happening inside of the housing market. Affordable housing is its own microeconomy, and it works off of a very different model, area median income and needs as defined by affordability, as defined by the federal government. But the reality is those numbers are so archaic and those models are so archaic that, quite frankly, everybody right now qualifies for affordability because life isn't really affordable. So, what's happening is everything is becoming area median income, and everything is becoming a requirement for a qualification anyway for aid, and that's not good, right? We're not going to be able to spend our way out of this. We're going to have to repurpose or rethink another microeconomy inside of housing first. Again, food, shelter, air, water, that physiological need level that can get to stable living. Once we have stable living, we can start to think about security. We can start to think about stability and finances and safety, and then move our way up to love and belonging and esteem. But like, we're not at sustainable. So that word was buried along with affordable at our board retreat a few months ago. I buried two words literally at our farm, took the words, dug a hole, buried them. And the first word was sustainability, because this isn't a place that we want to sustain currently, unless we're at the top of the triangle. If we're at self-actualization, yes, we want to sustain, but most aren't. There's 8 billion people on the planet. The second one is affordability, because I think it's too subjective.
Can technology be used to point to this housing problem and solve it? And if so, how?
So another hashtag you see me use a lot is total tenancy. I'm a recovering office developer, and we used to talk about tenants and tenancy all the time. And what was working with those micro economies was that an office term would be 5 to 7 years. After 5 to 7 years, we would completely gut the environment and come back and build it again, right? So it was this amazing volatility machine inside of the building that just created this economic engine, so to speak. And really, we don't do that with our homes at all. We buy a house, we have a 30-year fixed, we might do an addition, we might put some cosmetic upgrades to something, a new roof maintenance, but then 30 years later, by and large, it looks exactly the same. So a long way of getting to the technology part. Total tenancy is about technology. It's about how can we move more towards, if we're going to try to get to stable living, can we use better money? We hear the word stable coin, right? So we know that a lot of the technology that's persistent and interoperable in decentralized finance is just better because it's disintermediated. So there's efficiencies associated with it. But then also in the US now, we've got the Genius Act and the Clarity Act that are starting to define beyond commodities into real world assets. So I think there's a huge future in blockchain technology, decentralized finance, even stable coins and cryptocurrency to help push along some of these efficiencies, as long as we don't extract that value and profit and we return that efficiency back to a long-term stable model.
So I don't know if you saw, it was last week that China had 36 or something thousand drones all working together in a swarm to create a big screen over it. And they were talking about they could use this robotic drone technology to build infrastructure, to build houses. Do you see any proof of these cutting edge robotic technologies being used to bring down the cost of housing, to speed up the production of the housing?
Not to that level, not to the abstraction of like to the example that you just gave, but industrialized construction is something that we are absolutely using. We can build a better home in a factory. And we're proving that with our first project in Hudson, North Carolina, which hopefully we'll be announcing very, very soon. The rest of the world really does develop and build mostly homes in factories. The United States really still cobbles a lot of things together in terms of materials, sticks delivered out to the woods, and then the crews come out and then they assemble. And over a year and a half time or more, it turns into a home. The reality is we can do a lot of that with better quality control, with better materials management, with better project management inside of a controlled environment. So there's a huge difference between building with 40,000 drones into some, amazing object that's a real world asset versus bring a bunch of guys into an interior of a factory and building the same way in under one roof. And I think the middle of that is really where the most important innovation is happening right now in a lot of the roboticized processes, because once we figure out that repetitive motion and action and we can train ML to know that everything is precisely done, we're moving into a world where Henry Ford did in the early teens, right? We're going to start to be able to build quality housing across an assembly line process.
The drone thing that you referenced, Mark, I think about it solving the coordination problem, right? I think the bigger challenge, Chris, to me is how do we unlock access to that for people that don't have traditional. I almost think about the coordination problem applied to how people get financing for projects like that, and how those modes kind of collapse into smaller amounts instead of being these large, unattainable $400,000 loans for people. Like, what could that look like?
So responsible finance is a big part of this. In impact, it's going to take some impact investing to create a healthier financial model around housing. So let me start by telling you some of our secret sauce. Community land grants and deed restrictions are huge. That's a page from the playbook of private equity that we're seeing a lot.
Can you explain those two?
Yeah, sure. Separating the land and having a land owner or a land grant from the structure itself. So when you rent an apartment or buy a condominium, you are in the structure and you are, either renting or owning that structure, but you're not renting or you don't own the land below it. So you can on a community deed or on a community land trust, you can find impact investors that are foundations that have, or family office that have long-term thinking in mind, that are saying, I have this money, I have this resource. How can I do good with it? How can I do good to, how can I do well to do good? And one of the responses that I have for that is impact investment into community land grants. You can go in and buy a ton of land, sink your money in for a 100-year lease and let me build on top of it. And then create an ownership model for those assets, for those tenants, for those community members to own just the structure. And decoupling the land from the structure gives back all that value, right? So now they're not burdened with the cost of the land and the cost of the structure, a la single family home. So that's one way. The deed restriction is another one. And the reason that we're going down that path is Habitat for Humanity did this so well. When those habitat owners want to sell and move, they're obligated to sell back to Habitat. If they put that house on the open market, it would be subject to traditional market dynamics. So it restricts the actual value of the home in perpetuity. So it's counterintuitive, but it maintains that affordability over a longer period of time.
What's the disadvantage of that? Is there a disadvantage to that? Capitalism.
Yeah, capitalism, and why would you want to do that? And your home is how you get wealthy, and that's where your equity is locked into that. So What we have to do is also introduce new vehicles of investment and new opportunities to make money in other ways. The financial planners in my life that have been consulting into our stable living model, we shouldn't be spending more than 25% of our gross income on our housing. And we are at some age in place of the boomers are spending 50, 60, 70% right now. As their income continues to go down over time because they're simply receiving benefits in their retirement starts to run out. All of a sudden they're spending more and more trying to maintain their stability. So that's the obvious. I think that if we can start to reimagine a stable living model that's less extractive as it relates to housing, I think that would be a good start.
What can tech do to coordinate better? It's a coordination problem. So how do we coordinate better to make sure there's, enough people are doing it, but it's not at scale?
I'll speak to it again with our project at Hudson Commons. We have a community kitchen as part of our amenity space. So there's an old, grandma's 2,600 square foot single story brick ranch house on the property. And we were getting ready to imagine this project. Everybody scrapped it off the plans. And I was like, we're not scrapping that house. They said, well, what do you mean? I said, we're going to reimagine grandma's house as the future. And they said, what do you mean? I said, we're going to take that brick ranch and we're going to turn it into different use cases inside of the house. We're not going to use it as a single family home. We're going to turn the kitchen into a community kitchen. We're going to do industrialized stainless steel so that we can do prep work in there. We can bring in folks to talk about food. We can bring in a chef. We can bring in a local producer, whatever it might be. We're going to take the living room, which is the heart of the home with the hearth, and we're going to turn that into a co-working space so everybody can get out of their apartment or their unit and they can come meet somewhere to do some heads down work. And we're going to take the 3 bedrooms and we're going to use the short-term rental model so that when Jeremy comes to visit, because he's got a project in Charlotte, he can crash in one of those places because I have access to it on the app, right? So that home is being reimagined. The technology that it takes to coordinate that is the answer to your question, right? I think. And we get into the better food systems by creating a CSA for an entire community. We have 56 units in our property on 3 acres. We estimate that we'll probably have anywhere between 80 and 100 residents on that 3 acres. So now all of a sudden I can produce protein and veg from 2 and dairy from 3 of our small local producers. They can provide us food at one centralized location, and they don't have to worry about going to 7 farmers markets during the week to try to make $300 at each one. So that disintermediation through technology and the coordination piece is super important to getting to better shelter, better food, better water, better air. And just making that our baseline is our goal.
Do you see that model working in high density inner city housing complexes?
Not as well. And mostly because that missing middle product. So a lot of times when we're talking about the missing middle, there's 2 different perspectives. One is missing middle class, like the middle class is shrinking. That's happening too. But they share that terminology in real estate. The missing middle is actually a product type. So a 500 square foot efficiency studio apartment doesn't really exist in rural America. It does exist in the city in many forms, from impoverished all the way up to like super fancy building. So that missing middle product is upward mobility, 500 square feet, 750 square feet, two bedroom townhouse walkout, 3 bedroom walkout family home. All of that is going to be incorporated into our community so that we can provide the opportunity to sort of quote unquote move up as life gets more complex.
So you mentioned being a recovering office developer. How would you apply your model that you're testing here to like 10 floors of an office building? Or could you?
Yeah, that doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for a lot of people. It works for luxury. It works for experience. If you've got, a $3 million start and a $15 million penthouse, those buildings were not built that way. We like air. We like walkout areas. We like window lines in our homes. Those buildings are big glass boxes that are sealed. So kind of very tough to take a high-rise, central business district high-rise and turn it into housing. Definitely not affordable housing without massive subsidies. because it's a very expensive lift. Those buildings were built for different functions. Where there is big opportunity, Jeremy, is in the outskirts, 25 miles, 35 miles outside of town, where there's a 3-story, 4-building office park that is kind of run down. It's got the basic infrastructure for plumbing, or for water, for utilities, and it's steel and concrete, a 3-story mid-rise. There's opportunity there because the cost basis is lower. Those small businesses are not renting small offices, 2, 5, 7,000 square foot spaces as much because they're working this way. So there's a huge opportunity for adaptive reuse. But the central business district, as I mentioned already, has a missing middle product. They have options for people to live in a 500 square foot studio or a 3-bedroom walkout. So for our model, we see a bigger opportunity at the fringe of the city, really almost more so even out into the rural towns that have a main street, the Hallmark movie towns of America.
Are lease rates down far enough to make any kind of economic viability for a move for an owner of that building to do something different, or no?
Markets are a mess. Capital markets are a mess. And there's a future, if people are looking at the horizon, they're looking at the supply demand curve and realizing we have a ton of supply and the demand is going to wane over time because people are going to figure out remote distributed hybrid work models. So what's happening really right now is that distressed debt is going out to capital markets and it's going to auction off. So there'll be a huge opportunity, I think, for, opportunistic infill to adaptive reuse, to rethink and reimagine a lot of these assets in the future. But to do it with the affordability lens, a la Maslow's, physiological needs, those two forces don't usually get along very well because capitalism tends to be, how do we maximize profit and IRR for the GPLP? And affordability tends to be a little bit too far on the how do we give it away? How do we give a roof over someone's head and let them stay here without an opportunity for ownership? So the middle is the hard part. That's to me, that's stability.
Okay, so you move it out, to the outskirts, 20, 30, 40 miles from the city. Certain people live in the city because of proximity to work. So now you have a transportation issue. I'm not saying it's all great stuff, but I'm just thinking, okay, that's awesome. But how do we solve this next piece of the puzzle?
It's a great question. And infrastructure. So if you look at the biggest REITs, if you look at the wealthiest people, the people who are making the biggest plays right now, they're all investing in infrastructure. So I like to think that our Pathway Communities model takes process and turns it into product, and then turns that product into technology so that we can drive the cost down over time. What I'm aiming for is that stable living becomes infrastructure and it's investable as infrastructure. That takes a lot to get there. You have to have, for example, a microgrid, right? Without the capacity and distribution issues associated with our utilities. I'm going to put 56 dwelling units now where there were 2. Our infrastructure and the utility is freaking out saying, man, we're going to have to put up a substation. We're going to put in a microgrid. So that's infrastructure investment. Rural broadband.
Space-based solar power microgrid?
Yeah. Sovereign power. Yeah.
Maybe, in 5 years, maybe. Sure. So we're going to start with 0 to 1, figure it out. It'll probably be wrong or obsolete. That's okay. The infrastructure will be in place. Process to product to technology, drive costs down. Rural broadband's huge. That infrastructure and the stability of an internet for us right now, again, privileged. We're still online. We're streaming, probably. We're at high def. I can hear you and see you well. It's because I have a stable internet connection. I have fiber to the premise. Everybody in this world should have fiber to the premise, in my opinion. Access to information can help us get past so many hurdles. You can be underprivileged and have access and have a curiosity and have access to information and do fine. But if you're underprivileged and you don't have access to information, then you're going to find something else to occupy your time. And it's probably not going to be productive.
I love this ground up, grassroots, community driven solution. Are you alone? Who else is doing what you're doing? Is this happening in every American city? Is this happening across Europe? Is this something that can work in in the Sudan as well as it can in Pittsburgh.
It reminds me of those old shirts, right? Think globally, drink locally. So right now we're definitely drinking locally, but so is everybody else. So the network node effect is starting to take place where we have a community of people around our process of pathway communities and Hudson Commons and stable living. And all of a sudden we're hearing from another community that's in Graz, and they've been thinking this through because their process and their affordable housing models are totally different than ours, and they can relate to, they have stable shelter, but they might have inefficiencies or instability with their food system. So they're all of a sudden tied to interesting conversations. By taking that concept of affordable housing and turning it into stable living, we're now having great conversations with a lot of different network node effect people, and it's growing sort of exponentially, which is exactly what we wanted to do. Like, we're not going to nail all of it, but we're going to focus on stable living instead of just affordable housing.
Paint me a character. Who is this going to serve? What do they do for work? How much do they make? Talk me through. Give me a little character rep of this.
I'm glad you asked that. So I always say that COVID cracked the windshield, but Hurricane Helene smashed the glass. I was very heavily involved in the office product before COVID. I realized pretty quickly with the way that those buildings were built and the way that we shared indoor air quality, they were going to be short-lived. So I started sort of exploring other opportunities. The quick answer to your question, Jeremy, is civil servants. So our model is going to be built specifically around those who have chosen to serve their communities first. So we're qualifying that currently loosely as teachers, nurses, police, fire, medic, first responders. But at the end of the day, it's folks who have chosen to give to their communities or serve their communities more so than participate in traditional economic cycles and follow, corporate structure and leadership growth and that kind of thing. So that's what we're doing. And that's why we're teaming up with different towns around the country, because they love that story of how can we create workforce development to attract and retain the right talent. And the right talent being, we can't get people to drive our ambulances. We can't get people to stay in schools long enough to teach. And we can't get nurses to stay here to take care of our elderly because they can't afford to be here. So workforce development through civil service for upward mobility is absolutely our ICP.
Chris, thank you. As with all our guests, the closer from Kevin Kelly, what do we want humans to be? And how does technology help us get there?
Yeah, I want stability more than anything else. I just want to create that physiological level. I was privileged enough to be brought into this world with love and belonging already on the third rung. And I think that there's a way for us to sort of discover and revisit those physiological needs and get that stabilized. That's what I'm working on. I won't use the L word because legacy is not what I'm doing. What we're doing is really trying to build the long now.
I love it. Thank you.
Thank you guys. I enjoyed this.
Be disruptive. Stay
curious. Keep thinking on paper.
Wow. That was an emotional episode of Thinking on Paper. If you're still with us, and of course you are after that, if you have any questions about that show, email us at hello@thinkingonpaper.xyz, subscribe on the platform you're listening, and please, as a curious mind, share this with just one person in your life who would like to hear these conversations.
Maybe two. Share it with two.
Maybe two. Share it with two.